Imagine a sweatlord swordsman slicing an absolute NPC of a monster completely in half, looking like he just unlocked peak aura, while some dude wearing blue light blocking glasses and gripping his joysticks like his life depended on it screamed at the top of his lungs that he had finally managed to secure the dub. It was a wild scene where literally everyone wearing goofy-looking special glasses and holding over-engineered plastic devices was aggressively controlling their digital avatars, proving to the entire world that society had officially entered a dystopian era of virtual reality, where human potential was limited strictly by how much credit card debt someone was willing to incur to buy the latest gaming hardware. The young man who had just taken the ultimate L fell straight to his knees like a broken anime protagonist who just lost his entire backstory, while only a few feet away, a completely stunned female mage holding a glowing stick stood there watching the entire disaster unfold, totally paralyzed by the sheer second-hand embarrassment of it all. The victorious opponent slowly turned his avatar toward her, declaring in the most menacing, unhinged voice possible that she was absolutely next on his hit list, which prompted the mage to let out a blood-curdling scream and start sprinting away like she was running from her own toxic responsibilities, though everyone watching knew she absolutely could not escape her pre-rendered fate. Within a literal millisecond, a massive sword pierced right through her digital torso, ending her whole career on the spot, which caused the entire gang of sweaty tryhards, who took down both the random guy and the innocent mage, to start celebrating like they had just won a championship, fully believing that this toxic griefing session would easily propel them to the absolute top of the server rankings for this specific beginner event. Two random casual players stood in the background discussing this absolute clown show, quietly noting that these guys were actually a notorious team of washed-up pro gamers who made a living out of crashing low-level beginner events just to smurf on literal children and do whatever the heck they wanted because they lacked any real-world achievements. In this specific game, known to the streets as Negative State Online, a character's physical abilities were directly tied to their actual real-life capabilities, meaning that if someone was a couch potato in reality, their avatar would move like a dial-up internet connection, which made it hilarious that this entire gang of digital vandals was currently standing there completely oblivious to a high-velocity arrow flying straight toward their leader's throat. The arrow found its mark with terrifying precision, hitting the leader directly in his windpipe and cutting off his cringe victory speech instantly, leaving his generic henchman completely surprised and utterly incapable of understanding where the actual sniper shot had even come from. One of the sidekicks immediately started doing the absolute most, shouting for everyone to split up and locate the mysterious attacker, but before he could even finish his sentence, he also got hit squarely by another arrow, turning his character into an immediate meme. The two remaining members of the squad instantly entered an absolute state of panic, running around in circles because their small brains could not figure out where this phantom archer was hiding, until the camera panned up to reveal a sleek silhouette standing majestically on top of a jagged mountain peak. It turned out to be a mysterious black-haired guy coolly holding a bow and a quiver full of arrows, looking like a budget version of Megumi Fushiguro from Jujutsu Kaisen, proving himself to be the exact same archer who had just single-handedly humbled the most toxic gang on the server. Meanwhile, shifting back to the depressing reality of the corporate grind, a young man wearing generic glasses stood awkwardly in a brightly lit office, clutching a sad, cheap bouquet of flowers like he was a contestant who just got voted off a reality TV dating show, softly saying goodbye to his coworkers and mentioning that it had been an absolute pleasure working with them over the years. The people sitting at their dual monitor setups did not even bother to look up from their screens, completely ghosting his entire existence as a heavy, suffocating silence hung over the entire office like a bad cloud of corporate despair. The truth was that our glorious protagonist had officially quit this company, deeply convincing himself that it was vastly better to leave on his own terms with an ounce of dignity, rather than waiting around to be brutally fired by a management team that did not even know his middle name. That was just how the harsh reality of the modern world operated, especially since he had spent his entire youth working in a hyper-niche department that was dedicated to developing retro-style games, which were considered absolute ancient artifacts these days as the relentless march of time moved forward toward hyper-realistic graphics. His toxic manager had recently called his latest game development a bit too old-fashioned, and had openly described the core concept as somewhat vague and unprofitable, leaving the main character to walk down the crowded city streets completely lost in his own thoughts, unable to comprehend how anyone could treat the majestic retro genre with such total disrespect. But at the same time, if he was being completely honest with himself, he understood that his boss had absolutely zero corporate reasons to keep a middle-aged employee who practically lived in the past, especially since his pixelated game designs did not fit the fast-paced, high-graphics spirit of modern times whatsoever. The poor guy had absolutely no idea what to do next with his life, and while he technically had some meager savings tucked away in his bank account, he still desperately needed to find a new job before he ended up living off instant ramen for the rest of his days. As he continued his melancholic walk down the street, his attention was suddenly drawn to a literal child throwing an absolute temper tantrum on the sidewalk, begging his mother for some expensive new tech product, which caused the protagonist to turn around and notice the massive display window where the boy and his mother were standing. The window showcased a brilliant, flashy advertisement for a full-fledged, next-generation virtual reality game that promised to completely replace reality itself, making the protagonist realize that if he wanted to survive in this new world, he needed to stop being an absolute boomer and finally upgrade his lifestyle. A few hours later, a newly purchased VR game box sat neatly on his shelf, while the guy, still wearing his regular glasses, quietly fed his pet fish while deeply pondering how on earth he was supposed to install this massive piece of modern machinery without causing an electrical fire. A highly specialized, expensive gaming chair was now completely set up in the middle of his tiny room, looking like a piece of equipment stolen straight from the Tokyo Jujutsu High basement, representing the ultimate gateway to the most popular game on Earth that currently drew in millions of players daily. He knew very well that the modern gaming community had the attention span of a goldfish, meaning that if they got slightly bored, they would instantly migrate to another game, making users behave exactly like a massive school of migrating fish chasing the next big trend on TikTok. The guy finally figured out the complex wiring, took off his boring regular glasses, and carefully settled his body into the gaming chair, now sliding on a pair of sleek special VR glasses that made him look like he was trying to achieve peak corporate efficiency like Ayano from Classroom of the Elite. This was a digital era where people primarily connected and validated their entire existences through online games, and our protagonist had finally decided that he desperately needed to adapt to the times or risk becoming an absolute social NPC forever. From this day forward, he was determined to accept his fate as just another random fish in the massive virtual sea, ready to get completely swallowed up by the algorithm. The moment the game loaded, a blinding digital sun shone directly into his eyes, causing the dark-haired guy to squint aggressively as he found himself standing in the middle of a medieval fantasy street, completely disoriented and lacking any form of spatial awareness. Out of nowhere, someone greeted him with an overly cheerful voice, and when he looked down, it turned out to be a ridiculously small guide wearing a goofy hat and massive animal ears, looking like a mascot character designed specifically to sell plushies on Instagram. The tiny creature, enthusiastic, explained that the hero had officially arrived in the legendary world of NSO Nexteria, a place where dreams allegedly came true if you didn't get spawn-killed first. The guide randomly added that he had been waiting for the guy for an absolute eternity, warmly calling him Master Kyuji, which made the guy awkwardly thank him while internally having a minor existential crisis about his own username choice. His actual real-life name was Nagaji, but because he lacked any form of creative riz during the character creation screen, he decided that in this world, he would simply go by the name Kyuji. He remembered having an absolute mountain of trouble trying to customize his character, but since he planned on living in this virtual world for a very long time to escape his unemployment reality, he ultimately decided to make his digital avatar look exactly like his tired, real-life self. The enthusiastic guide pointed a tiny paw toward a nearby public park and informed him that weapons and skills could actually be freely used within the city limits, which was a wild game design choice. He quickly added that other players would not take any actual damage within the safe zone, but he highly advised against experimenting with his moves in public if he wanted to keep his secret abilities hidden from potential haters and clouters. The protagonist was genuinely and pleasantly surprised by this revelation, realizing that he hadn't fully grasped just how terrifyingly realistic everything was in this world, from the ambient breeze to the textures on the digital pavement. His deep thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the guide, who had suddenly paused his dialogue script to ask him a crucial question, requesting that he finally choose one of the three classic starting professions, which were the archer, the warrior, or the majestic mage. The guy was systematically told that each specific profession came packed with its own unique stats, specialized equipment, and powerful skills, though the game offered a highly generous grace period where he could freely change his profession within 3 days of his very first login. The guide also casually mentioned a massive plot armor mechanic, stating that he literally could not die during these first 3 days. The protagonist's imagination immediately went into overdrive, and he began picturing himself fighting massive high-level monsters while being completely invincible, basically visualizing himself as Gojo Satoru executing a flawless domain expansion against low-level trash mobs. Lost in his own absolute delusion of grandeur, he dreamed about how completely awesome and viral his combat clips would look if anyone were to post them on social media. Deciding that he desperately needed to check his actual power levels, the guy swiped his hand to open the main information panel, expecting to see some hidden main character stats that would make him the chosen one. Instead, the screen revealed a completely mediocre chart where all of his character's strengths and weaknesses were displayed in brutal, unedited detail, looking like a report card of pure disappointment. While carefully examining his basic data, the protagonist noted that a specific stat called Spirit wasn't entirely clear to his old-school gaming brain, but he figured he would just study that technical stuff in the future when he actually became relevant. Suddenly, a soft, melodious voice called out to him from behind, causing him to spin around on his heels like a nervous teenager. Three incredibly beautiful young girls were standing directly before him, smiling brightly and inviting him to join their exclusive team, causing Kyuji to instantly blush like an absolute anime trope while scratching the back of his head in complete surprise. He noticed their absolute high-tier aesthetic and awkwardly stammered that he wouldn't mind joining them at all, though he was deeply curious as to why these stunning girls had chosen an old-looking guy like him specifically out of a crowded plaza. The girl wearing a fashionable witch hat explained with peak customer service energy that they desperately needed a fourth person on their team to satisfy the game's strict dungeon queue requirements before they could go into a real battle. With an incredibly sweet, almost manipulative smile, she also noted that the guy looked secretly powerful and carried themselves with the aura of an undercover high-ranker, making the main character internally rejoice as he felt like his hidden anime protagonist abilities were completely obvious to the naked eye. Agreed pretty quickly to the arrangement and called the other girls over, while our protagonist privately vowed to show these youngsters exactly what a former veteran of the game industry was capable of achieving on the battlefield. However, cut to the actual battlefield, and the poor guy was already completely unable to keep up with the girls' basic walking speed, panting heavily like a broken leaf blower and pathetically begging them to wait up for him. He miserably noted to himself that while the game was supposed to replicate one's real-life physical stats perfectly, he could not control his digital body for the life of him, leading to the horrifying, unhyped realization that he was simply too old and out of shape for this modern gaming era. Suddenly, one of the girls screamed a frantic warning, shouting that an aggressive enemy was heading straight for his position at high speed. The protagonist turned his head only to see a literal rabbit with massive, terrifyingly sharp teeth hopping towards him like a demon straight out of a horror movie. Attempting to channel his inner warrior spirit, Hyuji drew his basic starter sword and prepared for what he thought would be an epic cinematic battle sequence. Breathing heavily like he was running a marathon in jeans, he loudly declared that he would personally take care of this monster, fully believing that this would be his ultimate breakthrough moment. The rabbit, apparently offended by his weak aura, let out a high-pitched scream and lunged directly at the main character's face with maximum disrespect. The guy swung his sword through the air with a massive, dramatic theatrical motion, fully expecting a clean slice, but he missed completely, looking like an absolute clown as the rabbit calmly dodged his attack midair with minimal effort. The monster opened its terrifying maw and instantly sank its sharp fangs deep into the main character's neck, causing Hyuji to let out an incredibly unmasculine scream of pure, unadulterated agony. Out of nowhere, a massive, explosive fireball appeared from the sideline and completely obliterated the rabbit into a pile of digital ash. The guy got a little burned by the splash damage, but the overwhelming relief that his life had been saved completely calmed his racing heart as he profusely thanked his teammate for rescuing him from a literal starter mob. The girl looked at him with an expression of pure concern mixed with deep judgment, asking him if he had forgot to adjust his pain settings, but the clueless protagonist had absolutely no idea what kind of settings she was even talking about. The girl explained with a sigh that these realistic pain settings were set to a brutal 100% maximum by default, because hardcore competitive experts believed it helped sharpen the other senses and made character movements way more precise. The guy was just about to open his menu to change the pain settings to 0 and try fighting another mob, but the girls quickly refused to let him, politely explaining that they had already held him up enough and that they needed to speedrun the rest of the event. They said a quick, awkward goodbye to the main character, thanked him for his brief service as a literal meat shield, and immediately sprinted away into the distance, leaving him entirely alone in the field. Hyuji's neck no longer physically hurt thanks to the game's auto-regen, but his emotional heart was completely shattered into a million pieces as he realized he had turned out to be completely useless. Memories of his depressing past immediately began to flood his mind, reminding him of the time a younger colleague at his old job had smugly told him he could go home early for the day. The main character remembered asking if he wasn't needed to help compile the game's database, to which his younger colleague had casually replied that he had already asked someone else to handle it because Chi was always way too meticulous and slow in such matters. The guy aggressively shook his head to push those toxic corporate memories away, desperately reassuring himself that it was only his very first battle, and that once he set the pain settings to 0, everything would be completely fine. Chi decided to return to the starter city to find a new squad, but little did he know, a brand new corporate-style hell awaited him in the urban plaza. He quickly realized that the frontline vanguard role did not suit his frail physical build whatsoever, so he decided to switch gears and try his luck as a magical mage. At first, everything seemed to go surprisingly well, and a random team actually offered to let him join their lobby for a quick hunt. But the moment the actual battle started, his teenage teammates kept aggressively arguing with each other and constantly criticizing his slow spell-casting times, treating him like an absolute burden. Chi fully realized that his tactical incompetence was entirely his own fault, but having to stand there and listen to literal teenagers scold him like a child felt way too humiliating for a grown man, so he rage-quit their team and walked away into the bushes. Realizing that being a simple frontline vanguard was actually less mentally draining than managing mana pools, the guy decided to switch his profession right back to a warrior before his 3-day trial expired. But in his very next team, his basic sword skills were once again completely unappreciated by the sweaty lobby leaders, who openly advised him to give up on that dream entirely and just become a useless background support character. The endless line of digital insults did not even end there, because during a chaotic skirmish, the main character accidentally unlocked a new skill called the Heavenly Blade. At first glance, it sounded like a high-tier, overpowered anime move that would give him instant riz, but the hilarious problem was the exact method of how he had acquired it. After constantly missing his targets over 50 times in a row, the game's pity system had literally awarded him a new skill out of sheer desperation to help him hit something. The entire team laughed at him hysterically in the voice chat, with one teammate openly stating that he would never be able to get a skill that embarrassing in his entire life, jokingly calling the main character an ancient old man while slapping him hard on the shoulder. Chi honestly couldn't tell if they were making fun of his entire existence or genuinely praising his dedication, especially since skills in this game were famously awarded not just for leveling up, but also for one specific, unique play style. Feeling completely roasted, he left that team as well, openly admitting to himself that modern online games and their toxic communities genuinely terrified his soul. Once again, Chi found himself trapped in a loop of his own depressing memories, visualizing the exact moment he had brought his formal resignation letter to his boss's desk. Looking down at the paper with complete indifference, the boss had actually asked him what his name was again, proving that Kyujin Nagai was so utterly irrelevant at the company that upper management didn't even recognize him. He had been completely determined to quit back then, telling himself he would stand strong even if his boss tried to desperately persuade him to stay for the sake of the project. But his boss didn't even try to stop him, only offering a generic, corporate apology and wishing him the best of luck with his next job search before immediately looking back at his phone. Snapping out of his sad flashback, Chi found himself standing back in the game world, awkwardly handing over all of his expensive starter gear to his now former teammates as a parting gift. The players were a bit surprised by his sudden generosity, but they greedily took what the guy handed them without a single complaint. He quietly told them that he simply didn't need the gear anymore, and after saying a polite goodbye, he walked away into the digital sunset, feeling that even within a fictional video game, he was completely useless to everyone around him. Hyuji decided he had finally had enough of the multiplayer experience, and concluded that he would just find a real-life job where he didn't have to interact with living human beings ever again. But just as he was about to log out, one of the random team members suddenly called out to his retreating figure from across the field. It was a guy with a funny, half-shaved punk head who told him that while the vanguard role clearly wasn't for him, being a mage wasn't a good option either because those guys were always being bossed around by toxic meta-chasers. The punk-style guy then casual suggested that the main character should try becoming an archer, encouraging him by saying that even if it currently wasn't the most popular or hyped profession on the server, patch notes could always change things in the future. QJI listened to this advice with wide eyes, feeling a tiny spark of hope ignite within his soul, and decided to give the game one last chance by transforming his class into an archer. He bought a basic bow and a set of arrows from a local vendor, but as he held the wooden weapon in his hands, he looked at his updated profile and genuinely couldn't understand what kind of stats he was looking at. He had tried his hand as both a warrior and a mage, and absolutely nothing had worked out for him, so he figured following another random player's advice couldn't possibly make his situation any worse than it already was. But after carefully checking the backend system files, he quickly realized exactly why this specific profession was completely dead and unpopular among the player base. Hugie noticed that compared to every other specialized profession in the game, the archer class possessed incredibly balanced, flat stats with absolutely no outstanding strong points or high damage modifiers whatsoever. The only minor advantage the class had was a slight boost in base movement speed, but he considered that completely useless for someone like him who preferred to stand still and panic during a fight. The poor guy had only one single shred of hope left to him, and that was a highly unique, weird status modifier that appeared at the bottom of his character sheet. He knew that for a warrior, the unique stat was Spirit, which heavily increased their core defense and physical attack stats during a brawl. For a magical mage, the unique stat was a Miracle, which gave them a random percentage chance to massively boost their spell effectiveness and critical attack damage. And for the neglected archer class, this unique, mysterious status modifier was simply listed as Range. Breathing heavily and sweating through his shirt, Chi ran through the dense starter forest, trying to find a test subject to see if his new class was complete trash or secretly broken. He finally managed to locate a monster roaming around a clearing, but the problem was that it looked a bit too large and intimidating for a level 1 player. Still, wanting to test exactly how effective this range stat truly was in practice, he decided to adopt a mindset where nothing ventured meant nothing gained. He carefully drew his bowstring back, took a shaky aim, and prepared to shoot his very first arrow. The system interface popped up to explain that the archer's unique status meant it literally increased arrow flight range by 1 single meter, which was then multiplied by whatever specific numerical value the player invested into the stat. Aiming directly at the massive monster's head, he confidently released the arrow, but instead of a majestic hit, the arrow traveled a few feet and stuck pathetic into the dirt ground nowhere near the target. The guy instantly realized that he absolutely could not hit anything from this safe distance with his current garbage stats, and he immediately considered increasing the numerical value using his saved level-up attribute points. Watching the scary monster slowly leave the clearing, he still hesitated for a brief second, but ultimately decided to dump his points and upgrade his range stat to see what would happen. He drew his bow back once more and fired, and this time the arrow flew straight through the air and hit the monster right in its scaly leg. Chi immediately started to celebrate like a child who just won a prize, but the giant monster, heavily feeling the annoying hit, slowly turned its massive head directly toward his location. The beast let out a roar and began aggressively chasing after our protagonist, who immediately flipped his lid and started fleeing for his life through the bushes, frantically trying to figure out what his next move should be. As he ran for dear life, his inner gamer brain started calculating exactly how many extra meters would be added to his total attack range once he managed to reach level 10. Chi thought about what his overall combat stats would look like if he managed to acquire a high-tier bow that possessed a natural increase in base range. If he could maximize this setup, he would theoretically be able to shoot monsters from an absolute mile away while remaining completely unnoticed by the enemy AI, achieving the ultimate dream of victory without ever having to engage in a real fight. This cowardly, campy strategy suited his lazy personality perfectly, as he wouldn't even need to hold his breath or dodge attacks. He just had to stand on a distant hill and lazily bombard his enemies like a human drone strike. He drew his bowstring again while sprinting, turned around, and took another wild shot that miraculously pierced the monster's shoulder. The protagonist noted to himself that compared to standard meta players, he would always severely lack raw firepower and flashy damage numbers. Therefore, he made the ultimate executive decision to focus 100% of his build on pure, unadulterated shooting range. He knew he would have to rely heavily on high-tier weapons and specialized skills later on to make up for his low damage, but he confidently thought that wouldn't be a major problem if the enemies could never physically reach him. Hugie began to endlessly bombard the angry monster with a barrage of arrows, realizing with immense joy that the beast was getting completely disoriented and couldn't figure out where the stealth attacker was hiding. He had officially found the single best strategy for his play style, and as he let another arrow fly, he recalled that he hadn't felt this amazing sensation in an incredibly long time. He had completely forgotten what it felt like to have fun, specifically the pure joy of testing his own wacky game design ideas in practice, and seeing them actually work against the system. Suddenly, the monster turned sharply in his direction, making Chi realize that he absolutely must raise his range to the absolute maximum level if he wanted to survive. But the enemy spotted his bright clothing through the leaves, and an intense chase sequence began all over again, completely unaware that an unknown, mysterious girl was quietly watching his entire goofy performance from behind a nearby tree. After somehow escaping from the clutches of what turned out to be a giant gorilla monster, Hughie decided to play it safe and spent the rest of his afternoon shooting at much smaller, weaker monsters. The guy decided to focus all of his remaining energy on leveling up within the safety of the beginner hunting grounds, and of course, he deeply wanted to get his sweet revenge on the local wildlife. He located a low-level rabbit and destroyed it with one single, incredibly satisfying sniper shot from 50 meters away. He continued to walk through the zone, shooting at random monsters left and right, and to his absolute surprise, he was actually doing incredibly well for a supposed old man. Chi was deeply shocked because he had never once held a real bow in his entire life, but for some bizarre reason, holding this virtual weapon felt like it was a natural extension of his own body. The protagonist effortlessly killed a few more rabbits, and a dramatic thought crossed his mind that perhaps becoming a long-range sniper was his actual destiny all along. The guy finally reached level 7 and felt an immense wave of happiness, noting that making progress and earning achievements felt way easier when you were playing the game like a total coward. He decided to hold off on upgrading his stats for a bit, planning to invest all of his saved attribute points at once so that the sudden jump in his range effect would be drastically more noticeable and satisfying. Meanwhile, the mysterious short-haired girl behind the tree was still stealthily tracking his movements, deeply curious as to how long this random guy planned to stay in the beginner zone, leveling up on literal rodents. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over the clearing, and Hughie found himself running away from a genuinely terrifying, enormous bear monster that looked like a high-level raid boss. Even within the supposed safety of the beginner grounds, there were hidden dangers that could easily reset a player's entire progress. Looking back at such a horrifying, bloodthirsty monster, the guy began to seriously doubt the game's map labeling, wondering how on earth this beast counted as a beginner mob. He firmly believed that any sane person should run away from such a huge monster rather than trying to fight it, and he even began to doubt whether his slow legs could escape its tracking range. The massive bear closed the distance with terrifying speed, and its roaring reflection was already clearly visible within the guy's wide, terrified pupils. The monster let out a deafening roar that shook the screen, but Chi decided that he wasn't going to give up and lose his progress without a proper fight. In a moment of pure adrenaline, he knocked 3 arrows into his bowstring at the exact same time, aiming them directly at the bear's wide-open mouth as it lunged forward. The projectiles flew straight down the beast's throat, and with a dramatic swing of its clawed paw, the massive bear stopped dead in its tracks, collapsing directly in front of the guy who was now lying flat on the ground in pure exhaustion. Hughie had somehow managed to defeat his strongest opponent yet, and the game system immediately rewarded him with a rare new item drop. He proudly praised his own quick reflexes, loudly wishing that those beautiful, toxic sorceresses from earlier could see him absolutely clearing high-level content all by himself. To make things even better, the guy received a prompt notification that he had unlocked a brand new skill as an achievement reward, which was titled the Close-Range Arrow. Looking around the empty forest, the protagonist wondered where on earth he could safely test out his newly acquired combat skill. Turning his head, he spotted a remarkably large, tall tree that looked like the perfect sniper nest. Breathing heavily like an old engine, he finally managed to climb all the way to the very top branch, where a breathtaking, beautifully rendered digital sunset unfolded before his eyes. This stunning view immediately brought back fond memories of his youth, making him wish he could stay logged into this world forever. But he ultimately decided it was finally time to call it a day and wrap up his gaming session. The guy realized he had leveled up quite a bit and now possessed 10 unassigned stat points sitting in his menu. Without a single shred of hesitation, he dumped every single point directly into his range stat, causing his status information screen to flash brightly. He was now officially a level 9 archer, and his total attack range had been permanently boosted to an absurd value of 25 meters. Sitting comfortably on the high tree branch, Chi carefully pondered his insane range capabilities and his rapid leveling progress, eventually deciding that he absolutely needed to test his new close-range arrow skill on a live target. Noticing another massive bear casually walking around the base of his tree, considering this the absolute perfect, risk-free opportunity to try out his new skill from a vertical vantage point, the archer cast aside all of his remaining doubts and decided to launch an attack. Aiming down his sights like a professional gamer, he activated the close-range arrow skill and smoothly released the taut string. The arrow pierced the bear's thick body with immense force.